Yeah, thank you so much. And let me also begin by thanking RRU for having me part of this discussion today. Uh, I, uh, the topic I was given is also very broad, so I may not be able to do justice to all the things, but I sort of want to start, given that this conference is on drones, and Alok also ended talking about how drones have impacted, the technology has impacted the battlefield, to suggest how the changing nature of battlefield and the evolving nature of technology are intertwining and presenting, I think, in more ways than one, the reality for our fighters, for our soldiers, as well as for policymakers, which meld a lot of the disciplines together. So unless we are able to bring all of these insights together and look at the broader picture, it becomes very difficult to make assessments either based simply on geopolitics or simply on geoeconomics or simply on technology. And I think that's in some ways the more interesting part from the analytical side. If you are analyzing today's battlefields, if you are analyzing today's challenges, you are looking at an entire conceptualization of bringing all of these aspects together. And therefore, I would briefly touch upon a few aspects which perhaps some of you might find of interest. But a few things that I thought I would touch upon would involve talking about the way warfare and the concepts around warfare are evolving. How is it linked to some of the defense technologies that are shaping that? Then I think a lot of, already we have heard a lot about vulnerabilities in supply chains, and finally some of the important implications for India and for the world. And I would begin by saying that some of the most interesting aspects of change here impinge on some of the assumptions that we have begun to question. Almost all of the things that perhaps the 1990s brought forth, this whole era of globalization, hyper-globalization, end of history of Francis Fukuyama, that the world is ending. The world, as we know, is evolved to a point where free market capitalism and liberal democracy would spread around the world. Wars would become redundant because peace would spread. I think that was essentially the theory of 1990s, that as countries, economies become interdependent, we are going to see less conflict, less violence among societies and within societies, and therefore perhaps we are going to see a more evolved version of the global order. Now, if you look at the world today, if you look at the assumptions that you have today, and if you think of some of the questions that you are asking today, they're exactly the opposite. It's true that, of course, great power politics never went away. And the wars never went away, because wars essentially, if they are extension of politics, then politics fundamentally about power capabilities, who gets what, when, and how, that essential question that we ask in politics never went away, whether domestically or globally. And that meant that the challenges for great power politics were there. They were just not visible. And I think by the time they got visible, our ability to use some of the older concepts was so prevalent that it took us a time to analyze and to think that something is back. We also had this very weird experience of entire geographies like European Union telling the world that we don't do geopolitics. We want to be a normative power. We want to be an evolved power. So now, if you look at what Alok also pointed out, how Europe is recalibrating, it is now trying to emerge as a geopolitical actor. That is a reflection of the fact of how the world had traveled in one distance and how it is now recalibrating and coming to its center of gravity in some ways. Now, if we look at some of the changes here, not all of them, but this idea that state-on-state wars are over became, or at least great power wars are over. Not state-on-state wars, but great power wars, which was this big idea at the end of the Cold War, that major powers will not fight. Major powers will not engage with each other kinetically because, of course, they're the nuclear deterrent, but also because they had no real incentive to go to war, because the wars are becoming very expensive if you do a simple cost-benefit analysis. Now that, of course, has changed, and the way state-on-state wars have evolved into more hybrid warfare is also seemingly in front of us. If you think of just Russia's hybrid warfare in Ukraine and vice versa. Since 2014, you have seen annexation of Crimea. Then you have all supported by a multitude of things. Supported by a multitude of areas where you saw cyber operations, disinformation campaign, proxy militias being used together. You have seen Hamas and Hezbollah both using tunnels, drones, psychological propaganda, cognitive warfare. I mean, all of that combined provide the space for the battlefield. So in some ways, it has moved, the idea of warfare moving beyond battlefields is a reality. Kinetic and non-kinetic operations together, and often being fought in the cognitive domains. I mean, in a sense that how do you manipulate media? How do you use unconventional tactics? How do you use certain environments like urban environment, media platforms, digital tools to offset military disadvantages? Now that again brings to the forth a new sets of issues to the table, that as not only battlefield technology, but societal technologies are evolving, economic and social technologies are evolving. How do you relate to them in the wider whole of a world approach, whole of a society, whole of a nation approach towards warfare? And that in some ways has been with us now for a while, looking at how warfare spans across domains and across platforms. Of course, this means that if you're looking at multiple domains, instrumentalities, and some of the examples that are in front of you that you are looking at on a day-to-day basis, you are looking at something where cyberspace and electromagnetic spectrum, all of them bring together certain operational realities for the battlefield. It is not simply a soldier fighting on what is a traditionally defined battlefield, but also societies themselves experiencing this realization that, look, this has moved beyond just what we experience, what our soldiers experience on the battlefield. And in some ways, the escalation ladder that powers states are climbing. It is very interesting because when we talk about climbing the escalation ladder, a lot of the discussion is happening in the context of what has happened in Pahalgam and how do you climb the escalation ladder from conventional all the way to unconventional. But it is often forgotten that you start today climbing the escalation ladder through non-kinetic means. In some ways, the whole idea of shaping the narrative, the whole idea of using the cyberspace, the whole idea of using cyber electronic warfare, the whole idea of using disinformation, misinformation campaigns. These are all the tools available that can cripple critical infrastructure, disrupt military communication, or even sway larger public opinion. So you are in almost shaping the larger discourse, larger narrative in a space that is far beyond the battlefield that we traditionally understand as. And therefore, when you talk of gray zone warfare, it has certain implications for both the soldiers on the battlefield as well as the policymakers back home, because they have to integrate this in a logic of its own. And this is conceptually, if you think of the generations of warfare, classic generations of warfare, from first to the fifth that we are talking about. In fact, the Chinese are talking about the sixth generation warfare already. So if you think of the fifth generation of warfare today, and if you think of what the Chinese are doing, for example, in Taiwan Straits or in South China Sea, or even in some ways with India, you are looking at how the information space is being captured and is being manipulated much before the traditional instrumentalities of warfare are being brought to bear on the battlefield. And that means that if you think of how the warfare has evolved from first generation onwards, I think this provides you an entire spectrum that you are not looking simply it in a linear perspective. Because again, very interestingly, Alok pointed it out also when he was talking of the Russia-Ukraine war, that you had the First World War methods being used in Ukraine as well. That you have the trench warfare being the reality in the Russia-Ukraine battlefield. But what it means is that you have the intergenerational approach to warfare, which you have to embed in your thinking, in your analysis of the battlefield, and in terms of how it is being shaped by both technological realities as well as the cognitive realities that you face. Now, in some ways, if you think of the causes of this, the causes are pretty self-explanatory, in the sense that if you have the technological momentum, and which has always been the case insofar as the wars are concerned, the technology had always played a very important role in the way battlefields have evolved over a period of time. You don't have to think of it in terms of today's technology. You have to look at it historically, and you need to think of how the offense-defense balance, for example, as it evolved on the battlefield, it impacted the ability of a state to conduct warfare, and therefore certain states that were able to capitalize on that, that were able to use that to their advantage, they had the military advantage, and they ultimately also had the power advantage. And in that sense, technological advancements give you a first dimension of analysis, which is in some ways has always been the reality. But what is increasingly very interesting is that this whole idea of economic globalization, that at one point was supposed to be a precursor for a new kind of world order, is today has become this explicit vulnerability in war fighting, explicit vulnerability in thinking about how do you deal with your adversaries, and it allows your adversary a certain advantage, both military-wise but also societally, that it can exploit through various means at its disposal. So all the things that we thought, right? If you trade with your adversaries, you might end up becoming friends. If you have cooperation on eventually cooperation on technology with others, you might end up doing you might end up making provisions for larger global public goods. All that is being turned on its head at the moment. Because today you are saying the old idiom that let's trade and become friends is now let's trade among friends. Strategic political comfort level is becoming the determinant of your economic relationship, which has been the experience of the last few years. So you're increasingly thinking of economics as not as an instrumentality to change the political reality, but vice versa. So geoeconomics, which is central to the way countries are now thinking about supply chains, about their technological prowess, about their manufacturing capabilities, and all this debate on building domestic manufacturing capability comes from this idea that certain kinds of critical sectors cannot be allowed to be in the hands of actors who might have malevolent approach towards you. So in that sense, the globalization landscape provides you some very interesting insights, which at one point were very different than what they are today. And therefore, if you're thinking of globalization, if you're thinking of technology, if you're thinking of how non-state actors have blurred this line through the use of technology, you are looking at a very different landscape. And again, the last point here about geopolitics and how the geopolitical landscape is changing, that increasingly this realization that security has to be embedded within one's own realm rather than being outsourced to others. If that realization today is coming to Europe, it is going to have profound implications for global geopolitics. And I think Alok talked about a lot of things that in the Russia-Ukraine crisis. And one of the most interesting developments from an analytical point of view is what the Germans are doing today. Germans are saying, we now want to rearm. We now want to become a quote-unquote normal state. Now think of your European history since 18th century. The single most important factor in European geopolitics was Germany. If Germany rises, I think, Mr. Putin may have done many things because of Ukraine and may have achieved something and lost something. But I think he fundamentally miscalculated this aspect. I think for the next several generations, Russians would be mired with the German question, which has been revived in the European landscape. Because Germany has single-handedly decided the European history for the several centuries of the past. And if they do rearm, if they do things that they are saying they would do, it would end up putting Russia particularly in a very difficult position. And so the whole logic of Russia emerging as a global power, the global landscape, you can bury that, and you can think of Russia primarily trying to manage its own periphery, particularly now as Germany starts to do certain things with their own capabilities. Now again, it may not happen. Europeans have a way of, especially in the last several decades, of undercutting themselves. But I think this is the single most important development to watch out for if you are doing long-term analysis of what is likely to happen in Europe and as a consequence in the world order. But I just wanted to lay out some of the reasons here for what perhaps one needs to think about. The other aspect, of course, which most of you would be familiar, is the questions that increasingly AI and the changing technological landscape is raising, both in terms of the ability of human-technology interface as well as the governance realm that we are witnessing. Do we have the frameworks available to think through some of the implications that are coming our way? Some of these questions arose during the nuclear revolution. When nuclear revolution started, a lot of people started asking very fundamental questions about the ability of human technology interface. We are back in a situation. We thought that it was contained. There was an argument that, look, we have created this entire paraphernalia around nuclear weapons, and we have managed it well. Countries are rational actors, and through that rational logic of mutual assured destruction, we have created an arms control and nuclear non-proliferation frameworks. They will work because there are certain ethical standards we have created, normative standards we have created. I think what we are looking at today is exactly a similar context, but you can sort of ratchet it up by multiple factors, because we are going through a technological revolution of a kind where the agency of human beings to define the parameters of that engagement is severely limited. So you are now going to have to create another level of that engagement, and unfortunately, we are also at that phase where where great power politics is at its height. So again, a lot of this discourse would going to be embedded within the larger great power politics, and so how do you define the parameters of that engagement would be a very important part of how you think about the use of AI on the battlefield. Now, if you just look at tech dominance, and which is often talked about as geotechnology, right, that ultimately the balance of power of the next century or emerging a few decades would be decided by who controls these critical and emerging tech, who has an advantage, who can use that advantage both on the battlefield and beyond, because this is not simply now a question of traditional battlefields. This is a question of a whole of nation, whole of society approach to these questions. We are looking at fundamentally the strategic leverage being used by a lot of these actors, and the role of the private sector becomes critical in shaping this whole of government, whole of society approach. States here will not be the most dynamic element in deciding. They will be forced to create certain frameworks, but ultimately it is for the private sector, it is for the other actors, non-state actors within certain societies, within our society itself, to define the framework and to push the boundaries for these developments. Because ultimately the instrumentality is controlled only partly by the state. And so when you are looking at tech dominance as a strategic challenge, you are looking at there's some problem here, but the idea here is to look at strategic dependency and fragility in terms of supply chain resilience. So if you think of global reliance on semiconductors and rare earths, and these are two good examples. If you think of Taiwan, why is Taiwan so important from a semiconductor point of view? If you think of why there has been so much of angst about Taiwan, a question that seemingly was resolved till a few years back, resolved in a broader sense that no one was willing to change the status quo, suddenly you find this pressure to change the status quo in the Taiwan Straits. And that is, of course, there is a logic from the Chinese perspective, which is a great power logic, China rising, but there is also a logic of what Taiwan brings to the table in terms of the semiconductor prowess that it showcases. And so you are looking at the challenge of supply bottlenecks. You are looking at the vulnerabilities in critical defense imports. And all of these issues become critical in the way we have been talking about economic interdependence, the way we have been talking about critical sectors of growth and dynamism for individual state actors. And therefore, modern military and commercial supply chains rely heavily on the networked system, this idea of networks and how modern supply chains rely on them. And these systems are vulnerable fundamentally to the cyber landscape, cyber attacks, which we have seen. The ability to destroy or paralyze. We know certain sectors, certain critical sectors those have been targeted, both in India, they have been targeted abroad in other conflicts, and their vulnerability that is being exposed to the wider world provides you that space, that demand, that need for diversified and resilient supply chains becomes very, 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 very apparent. Now, in terms of what is the impact? The impact is your threat perception. The threat perception is shifting. The ambiguity in threat perception is always there. It is never clear. The clarity that I think often militaries demand, often policymakers demand, that is not there. There is the use of certain kinds of technologies increasingly being visible, weaponization of information flows, and how do you shape the battle of narratives, that is critical. And finally, how do you attribute? What is your response? If you can't attribute, then how do you respond properly? And therefore, this ambiguity fundamentally changes the way policymakers will have to always operate in the gray zone. There is never going to be a black and white approach to many of the questions, many of the security challenges that lie ahead of us. And that fundamentally alters the cost-benefit risks. That fundamentally alters the space in which both the militaries and the policymakers have to operate. And that, I think, often people forget. When you're looking at modern-day conflicts, when you're looking at modern-day responses of people, that you often forget how difficult it is in more ways than one to shape the battlefield, to shape the responses. I think Alok also alluded to this idea of why Trump has found it so difficult to contain, or conclude to even contain the conflicts. He was saying in 24 hours, I'll do this, I'll come to power and I'll resolve all these problems. He has found it so difficult because conflicts have a logic, always have a logic of their own, wars have a logic of their own. But also in today's time, the ambiguity that surrounds most of these conflicts, the end game, the instrumentalities that are available to actors, that makes it virtually difficult even for a power like the US to impose its full force on these conflicts and bring them to bear on actors like Ukraine and Russia, or even in Israel for that matter, in Gaza, if you look at how the war had progressed. Now, what it means for defense technologies and its impact, it means that, of course, you are going to see an accelerated race towards superiority, that you are never going to achieve a kind of a balance that many are advocating, that let's get together and have a framework, because you're not going to get that framework because you have not reached that sense of maturity in the evolution of this technology. It is still evolving, and all countries, all major powers want to achieve the dominance. Once you have the certain level of dominance, then you talk of arms control. Then you start talking of regulatory frameworks. Until you achieve that level of superiority, no one is going to sit down with anyone else and create that framework. So everyone is on its own, every nation is on its own to define the frameworks and to define the capacities that it wants to build. And therefore, the ethical and legal challenges that will come will force, I think, the militaries around the world to think more copiously about this matter, or they should. And I hope that we all are, because this question of how do you use these kinds of technologies and what are the ethical and legal implications of the use of these technologies, this is going to dominate the landscape. We have seen how even on traditional technologies, the issue of legality and this issue of norms has been a big issue for the militaries. Now, how do you control escalation? How do you climb the escalation ladder in such a situation? That, again, is something that becomes a great degree of vulnerability. Because what is likely to happen and what is increasingly happening is, if you have AI-driven weapons and drone systems, you will shift, or you will be able to shift the decision-making power from the humans to a trained model. Now, if that is happening, or if that is likely to happen, then what are the capacities, what are the capabilities that you have that human agency can perform? You're also speeding up the data analysis process. So there is a certain sense of urgency in speeding that up. But AI's, this uncertainty means that the risks are very high, and the human agency's interface, that is very limited, that becomes very limited. So how do you ensure that policy making, that technological evolution, that a whole of government and whole of society approach evolves in this sense is perhaps the singular challenge at the moment, which comes with its own set of challenges if you think of supply chain vulnerabilities. That is something that COVID-19 taught the world, taught India, that you cannot really have, without resilience, there is no point in having economic growth. And that is something that became very vivid during COVID-19, but it was also becoming very vivid before. If you think of Chinese coercion of Australia, economic coercion of Australia, it happened before COVID. And the idea was very, very simple, that I have dominance over you in certain areas, and I will use that dominance to ensure that I get political objectives from you, to meet my political objectives. And this weaponization of trade, weaponization of technology, weaponization of information, weaponization of everything, that has become the norm, which means that the supply chain vulnerability for a nation that is trying to be resilient and that is trying to be autonomous in some ways in decision making is going to be very, very significant. What are the risks? Most of you would be aware of the risks, of course, of these kind of disruptions. But the most important risk here, of course, delays and exposure to adversarial control. But this idea of a strategic coercion by supplier nations is a reality that cannot be denied. That this sense that economic interdependence will breed greater responsibility. It will breed greater stakes in each other. That was a highly strategic approach to the whole problem of politics. That politics being looked at through a very, very economic lens. That if you have economic interdependence, you can perhaps shape the political contours of a relationship in a positive direction. Today, if you look at it, it is exactly the opposite, that unless you have political trust, you are very unlikely to give you are very unlikely to shape your economic relationship with your partner in ways that perhaps allows you certain kinds of political outcomes. And therefore, necessity for diversification and self-reliance becomes self-evident, that it is not simply about anyone giving a great mantra to anyone, but it is simply the reality of the present-day geopolitical and geoeconomic construct. And what does it mean in terms of the strategic lessons? That if you think of deterrence, you are looking at deterrence through a multi-domain lens. If you're thinking of national security, you're looking at it from a whole of society approach. If you're looking at adaptability becomes very, very critical. Flexibility becomes very, very critical. But also in some ways, I think for a country like India, it is inevitable that while we start or invest and engage our domestic ecosystems, certain kinds of collaborations in high-end technology will be needed, will be required in the short to medium term. And that means to figure out who our partners can be, where are those collaborative opportunities that India can tap into. And this means a certain kind of a global outlook which allows you to tap into those vulnerabilities. And there is a very interesting dynamic. If you think of last decade's foreign policy, there are two geographies where the Modi government has invested a lot. It's just sheer data. If you look at the visits, if you look at the kind of engagements, if you look at the high-level investments. And those two geographies are, one is the Middle East and one is Europe. And if you look at why the investments have been made the way they have been made, I think this story is self-evident. That while you need, Alok said, America will not come to your help, and I agree, no country will come to your help. But I think certain countries would be needed as you try to manage your most important strategic strategic challenge. And therefore, the collaboration with certain countries who may be like-minded, and no one is like-minded for the entire duration of eternity. You are like-minded for a while, and I think you need to use that moment to tap into that opportunity when almost every country wants to befriend you. So why not make most of that opportunity and try to ensure that where you get those capabilities, niche capabilities, and Europe is flooded with countries which may be very small. You look at Baltic countries and look at the cyber capabilities. It's a no-brainer that those partnerships can really give you something in return, which very few countries elsewhere. I mean, the way Baltic countries have stood up to Russian misinformation campaigns, cyber campaigns, it's something to learn and to absorb for our own good. So I think certain kinds of niche capabilities from collaborative partnerships should be the norm for India, and therefore. I think in some ways this multi-alignment policy helps India to absorb those policies. Now, how long can you be multi-aligned in a world of great power contestation? That's a separate matter. But finally, in some ways, lessons for India remain the same. That indigenization. It's strengthening of certain kinds of capabilities, private sector coordination, strategic partnerships for technology transfers. And I do think that there has to be some modicum of thinking behind how do you approach these partnerships, how do you approach certain frameworks, how do you approach building a resilient and secure supply chains in India. That it has to start from a review, which I think General Khandari was talking about at the beginning, that if this is a year of reforms, then those reforms should entail a lot of what traditionally is not considered to be within the purview of defense. So it has to be somewhat more of a whole of society approach. And finally, to return to where we started, that it is truism to say that, look, warfare is evolving. But I think at the end of the day, if you have to keep yourself alive to the change, keep the nation alive to the possibilities, then you need to invest, you need to collaborate, and you need to ultimately ensure that the whole of society is underpinned by that momentum that the government is setting in for defense, because defense alone will not be able to generate the kind of capabilities that you need, and defense alone is not the solution to most of the problems that perhaps India faces. So therefore, the synergy of defense with other sectors, including the private sector, should be the norm rather than an exception. Thank you very much. Yeah.